My Twitter following, my huge Twitter following, is actually part of an interesting experiment, which is, within WPP, how many Twitter followers do you need to have before you become impossible to fire? Because the reputational damage you can inflict is simply too great. That's my hope, anyway. The test's still running. What's fascinating, actually, about Twitter is it's quite commonly said it's not an advertising medium. Well, it all depends how you define advertising. If you're a Darwinian psychologist, you would say Twitter is exclusively an advertising medium, and it's a medium which people use to advertise themselves. Now, I don't mean that in a completely self-interested, kind of self-promoting way. Has anybody read a book by Geoffrey Miller called Spent, or The Mating Mind? This is the whole theory, really, about Darwinian signalling theory, that we have evolved to advertise our genetic fitness through the display of general intelligence, one level, and the big five personality features, which I think in order are openness, conscientiousness, agreeableness, stability, and extroversion. These are just considered the big five personality types, plus general intelligence. And one of the things you can see is, in sort of classical economic terms, restricting the number of characters someone can use makes absolutely no sense. You would obviously get more utility in conventional economic terms if you allowed people to write as much as they liked. But of course, a degree of difficulty allows for better signalling. There's a man called Zahavi who talks about costly signalling, that in order to be meaningful, signalling has to have a cost, which is either a financial cost, in other words, it makes it expensive to do, or in this case, a kind of cost in terms of a degree of difficulty. And the fact that it imposes that degree of difficulty on you, that you have to be concise, and as Visit England showed beautifully, concise and clever and witty within a form, makes it all the more potent. That the very restraint, as someone said, actually, if you'd made Twitter give people unlimited characters, it'd be like playing tennis without the net. You need that degree of difficulty to make the thing meaningful. Now, the reason I mentioned this signalling theory is it's very interesting, that it effectively says that it is instinctive among us to effectively, advertise ourselves. And of course, one of the paints or the tools we use to actually promote and define ourselves to other people is, of course, brands. Because the brands we choose and the brands we talk about and the brands we choose to identify with and affiliate with are kind of a palette, amongst a much wider palette, of what you might call little pieces of data compression, little bits of information we use to actually define and therefore promote ourselves. But interestingly, Miller, in his book Spent, proposes, and this was about 4 years ago now, I guess, he proposes that the fundamental patterns of consumption will change as a product of social media. Because previously, the things you bought to display status or wealth or even intellect had to be tangible and visible, and they tended to be bought things, ideally those things that you wore or carried around or drove around in. And suddenly he said that actually, fundamental patterns of economic consumption, if you accept this Darwinian theory that an awful lot of what we do is driven by identity and status seeking in some form or other. It's much more complex than simple luxury goods and bling, by the way. But if actually we seek status within a group, or we seek to identify with groups and we use brands to achieve this, then Miller's prediction was that patterns of consumption would fundamentally change, because actually we will shift partly to an experience economy when it becomes much easier to share experiences. And so if you think about it, when I was broadly speaking 18 or 19, the obsessive status indicator of anybody who grew up on the Welsh borders in about 1979 or 1983 or whatever, reached sort of vague maturity, was the car. And it's very interesting that The Economist, I don't know how many people read in the latest Economist, an article suggesting that among particularly urban youth, the car as a status object has virtually no meaning. It's seen almost as a utility. Many people are starting to join things like Zipcar. People are joining things like, car sharing schemes. And actually, you see a very fundamental change, where suddenly experienced things which might be attending a concert, and if you notice the live music industry is absolutely thriving, when you can actually talk about those things and they become publicly part of you, the incentive to go, the Darwinian incentive to go, becomes much greater. So actually this experience economy, which everybody's been talking about, is both an experience economy and, in a sense, a status economy, because suddenly sitting at home and drinking very interesting alcoholic drinks, which was previously a private occupation by necessity, can, if you wish, become a public one. So I think one of the interesting things you'll see is that whole patterns of consumption and status seeking will actually shift. And this is a very, very interesting point, by the way, the Darwinian signalling theory, because one of the things, I'm just going to do political incorrectness alert here, because if you do get into Darwinian psychology, you do tread very dangerous ground. Geoffrey Miller himself won the Ig Nobel Prize about 8 years ago. The Ig Nobel Prize is awarded for the most scurrilous piece of academic research in the previous year. And his research proved, to an extraordinary level of certainty, that the earnings of lap dancers go up when they're ovulating. Okay. So I do warn you that if you get into Darwinians, what is interesting about that is the lap dancers themselves and indeed the audience may not be consciously, probably are not consciously aware of ovulation, but it was proof that there are actually signals that we detect of which we aren't consciously aware, but which fundamentally affect our behaviour. But one of the interesting things here is that it's worth remembering that there's the finance director's role, definition of evolution, and what you might call the finance department's definition of evolution, which is a constant drive for ever greater efficiency, the avoidance of waste, bodily health, efficiency, survival, that kind of thing. But it's also worth remembering that even nature has an advertising budget. That actually, other than surviving, the most important thing you can do is attract a mate of equivalent or higher genetic fitness to yourself. And so proxies are used to actually determine precisely who's desirable. The peacock's tail is, of course, the most extreme manifestation. Female peacocks or peahens more or less have a heuristic, which is, when in doubt, you go for the one with the larger tail. And so nature has a very large advertising budget. In fact, more interestingly, by a process called X-adaptation, much of the progress that took place in evolution is believed to be advertising-led. Now, Darwin came up against this problem of intermediate stages. What use is half a wing? How could you evolve a wing? You can't be a strange wingless creature and suddenly, your descendants suddenly sprout enormous wings which are capable of flight. What's the use of half a wing? And the theory was that actually feathers, interestingly, to an extent, partly evolved through possibly temperature control. But actually, just as some creatures developed enormous tails for purposes of sexual display, others developed enormous plumage on their arms. And this, first of all, helps them to glide, and then, over time, by that process. But the actual incentive for this particular development was advertising, not immediately, in the intermediate term, it wasn't actually genetic fitness. Quite the opposite. It was, to some extent, a small handicap. But in terms of Darwinian selection and signalling theory, it conferred an enormous mating advantage on you. A few interesting facts. Guppies, by the way, have a 3-order heuristic of how you choose a male guppy. Female guppies do the choosing, as is only right. They will look at 2 guppies, and the first question they ask apparently is one guppy 50% or more larger than the other guppy? And if so, they breed with the larger one. Okay? Size is, if you think about it, quite a good proxy for genetic fitness. The brain's being actually highly intelligent here because, A, it suggests you're doing quite well in the food chain, and also you've survived quite a long time. If one male guppy is not 50% larger than the other one, they move on to stage 2, which is they breed with the guppy which is more orange. So very much like the people of Essex in that respect. And again, like the people of Essex, if the guppies seem to them equally orange, they move on to social proof, which is if they've seen one of the guppies sleeping with one of their female friends, they go with that one, on the grounds that if it's good enough for her, it's kind of okay for me. Okay? Now, This is very interesting. Now, the reason I'm talking about all this is that I thought it was interesting that a Darwinian, signalling theorist, and costly signalling is one of the great things, that in order to be meaningful, it's got to be difficult to do. Because if in order to have actual meaning, that you can deduce that this guppy is healthier than that guppy, it actually has to be costly in resources or degree of difficulty. And so it was very interesting that this book, I think written more or less before Twitter, started to predict that once digitally we started sharing our information, first of all, a degree of difficulty is handy, and secondly, that actually patterns of consumption may start to change. And it is interesting, no one is, the vital thing to remember about this advertising, this self-advertising thing, is it largely takes place instinctively. We do it all really without being consciously aware of it most of the time. And we seem to have a sort of constant cool meter going on in our heads, which actually is to some degree beyond our control. But that's just one, by the way, it goes further, if you want me to stray further into political incorrectness. We think we're, of course, as humans, above all this stuff. Male penis size increased massively in primates when they started walking upright. Male gorillas have a penis that's about ½ an inch long. They can breed perfectly effectively that way. But when things started walking upright, it became more important to advertise yourself. And similarly, just in case you thought this is just men who are guilty of this advertising effect, there is no actual reason why female breasts need to protrude from the body at all. It's perfectly possible to lactate. In fact, female chimpanzees lactate perfectly well without it. It's actually an advertising effect, which is costly. Effectively. I won't go any further than this because I stray into dangerous territory where you lose your job in a single afternoon. But the point I'm making about all this is that when we went to school, there were two things. There was science, where you had a right answer, okay? And there was history or English, which was a bit like those Olympic events which are judged by a panel of judges. It was kind of subjective and down to someone else's opinion. And we've all left school with this idea that what is scientific is absolutely mathematical, numerical, correct, provable with a single right answer. The surface area of a cone, for example. And then everything else is just vague and dangerous. And the reason I talk about this to such an extent, and why I say marketing is a science, it's just not that kind of science, is that I believe that marketing, and particularly the marketing vocabulary, can be hugely enriched by the understanding you can derive from complexity theory, network theory, behavioral economics, Darwinian psychology, huge numbers of soft sciences. And actually, it's vital that we start to enrich marketing with understanding from these areas. And you're going to ask why. Well, in a way, as significant as the invention of the World Wide Web was a completely unwritten about, unnoticed and unmentioned development in technology a few years earlier, which was the invention of the spreadsheet. And Martin mentioned the fact that he thinks that finance and procurement have become too powerful within organizations. And you could say, if you wanted to write a book about it, and as far as I know nobody has, that it was the spreadsheet that particularly enabled this to happen. Because suddenly you created an environment within business where anybody who had numbers or a mathematical model automatically won the argument over someone who didn't. That broadly speaking, abstract nouns just don't cut it in business. Now, I've sat as a non-executive director on a few boards. And, I'm a former copywriter. I've spent my whole life in marketing. I'm not totally unrealistic, okay? I didn't expect them to sit around all the time in the board meetings discussing, like, brand iconography. Let's be reasonable here. I knew that 90% of the conversation would be around some metric or some financial target or other. What I didn't expect is that it was about 99.9%. I think 65% of CEOs appointed since the financial crisis have actually come from the finance function in the UK. And what makes this so dominant is we've created this thing that anything with numbers is a science, and anything without numbers, without a mathematical model, can effectively be discounted. So what's happened is the spreadsheet and the pie chart have become within business today the equivalent of Norman French in 12th century England. Which is you can kind of scrape a living if you don't speak the language, but you can't expect to aspire to any kind of position of authority or power, because the entire language of decision-making has become just completely numerical. And that in itself is a fundamental philosophical problem which we ought to actually challenge as marketers. First of all, because the model that almost everybody in finance and almost everybody with an MBA adopts is, without necessarily knowing it, a very crude interpretation of the neoclassical economic model. Okay? And that, there's nothing particularly terrible about that model if you call it a model. But as very good economists say, all models are wrong, but some of them are useful. And that model started off as an aid to thinking, but without us realizing it, it's become a substitute for thinking. It's actually just become an axiom or an assumption. Second thing you've got to realize, it is a model which, because every single part of that model is based on the assumption that humans act individually on the basis of absolutely perfect information, and that they have absolutely constant preference, okay? All three of which, by the way, being total bullshit in the real world. It almost never happens. But because of those assumptions, it is extraordinarily hostile to marketing. Insanely hostile to marketing, because anybody who's been brought up in that business school environment basically believes that consumers are, or at least should be, perfectly rational, and that in aggregate they will be perfectly rational, and that obviously they will prefer paying a lower price than a higher price, which, by the way, the most basic assumption of neoclassical economics is not true. Do a test, put a dress in a catalogue at 3 different prices, send it out to 5,000 people. You'll probably sell more dresses at £29 than you will at 34. Interestingly, you'll sell more dresses at £39 than you will at 34. So that basic assumption that the price-demand curve slopes one way is wholly erroneous. The idea that we have this extraordinarily sensitive price meter which is insensitive to context and is actually perfect at making the decision, shall I buy a cup of tea or shall I save up £1.96 towards a holiday to Thailand? Okay, i.e. complete bullshit. If you needed to make a decision in a supermarket based on maximising utility with a budget of £100 and 30,000 SKUs to choose from, and you needed to know how to maximise your utility, even if you were a supercomputer, it would take you 12 billion years to come to an answer. We don't do that. We shop within categories. We have category norms that set our price assumptions. I mean, utterly mad decisions are taken. I mean, Tesco's big price drop, where they reduced investment in the club card product and sort of cut prices by a small amount across the board. Again, that was an example of, I think, neoclassical-led decision-making. The tragedy of that is that when you do drop prices, all you do is set a lower norm for that product, brand, or category going forward. You will enjoy a short fillip in sales, after which point, if you think about it, anybody here an economist, by the way? I mean, the consumer surplus is the difference between what we'd be prepared to pay for something and what we have to pay. The interesting thing about the consumer surplus is it creates no enduring pleasure. Now, most of you, I think, I'm not stereotyping you as a load of rich people, but I mean, most of you, I think, if you had to pay £2,500 for a big plasma screen TV, would actually pay it, wouldn't you? If that was the cheapest you could get a plasma screen TV for, most of you by now would have actually gone out, bitten the bullet and bought one, right? Some females, of course, have bizarre hostility to this. It does cause gender problems. My wife said, but it'll dominate the room. But that's exactly the point, I said. I'm not spending £2,000 on a huge plasma screen and hiding it discreetly behind a Japanese screen. What on earth are you talking about? Right, but anyway, but cutting aside that slightly bizarre thing, and middle-class telly guilt as well, which is, I think, one of the worst destroyers of happiness, to be absolutely honest. Just go and buy a big telly. Stop fighting it, okay? But none of you, when you can now buy an equivalent television for £800, even though you'd be prepared to pay £2,500, none of you come out of that store going, high five, I've got £2,500 worth of value for only 600 quid. Why? Because our mental frame of comparison actually just drops with what prices are. The mobile phone industry in the UK has killed itself, effectively, through exactly this. That by the mindless race to the bottom in the pursuit of market share and new customer acquisition, we now have most of the proceeds do not go into investing in the network. They go towards handing out free handsets to encourage people to switch. And you have really what is a catastrophic market failure, I think, in UK mobile telephone networks, which is caused by that endless chasing of new business based on neoclassical assumptions. So what I'm saying here is that it's a very dangerous assumption, but it has become an assumption. It is no longer a model. The problem we have in marketing is we don't have a model. We don't have a mental model of how people choose or act. We may, by the way, never achieve one, but we should at least try. just to show that there are people out there who fundamentally dissent from the neoclassical model. There is behavioural economics. Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Prospect theory points out that actually, we have absolutely, the idea that we make decisions in sort of rational probabilistic terms is fundamentally wrong. Deal or no deal annoys neoclassical economists, okay? Because you should surely just play for the, when the banker makes you an offer that is less than your statistical expectation, you should obviously reject it. Now, incidentally, Sir Martin would be right to reject it. If you're very, very rich already, okay, you can actually play deal or no deal completely rationally. But in fairness, what the neoclassical economic model is completely blind to, because it has no understanding of it, is regret. And most of us will actually take a small cut in an offer, or quite a big cut in an offer, to avoid a lifetime of regret. Think about it. If you were offered $25,000 by the bank, you thought you'd hold out for the expected return of 35, and then you ended up with 50 pence. You'd spend the rest of your life kicking yourself, and you'd be known down your local pub as Loser Dave. It's worth taking a loss, completely rational and intelligent, or ecologically rational, to take that loss to avoid that consequence. But again, neoclassical economics doesn't understand that at all. Neoclassical economics, is fundamentally blind to most of the human emotions. It also assumes that transactions take place in isolation. And therefore, that we don't have any kind of mental relationship with the people we do business with. So one of the most common and wrong-headed statements about the web that appeared in The Economist repeatedly was, in the early days of the internet, The Economist and people like that would repeatedly say there will be no customer loyalty on the internet because a cheaper price is always one click away. Another beautiful thing where I thought neoclassical economics got it wrong was they actually said, I was on a neoclassical sort of economics blog, and they were discussing Amazon Prime, which I think is one of the cleverest, psychological ideas. You pay an amount of money up front as a commitment device, and for the following year you get free next day delivery. So it's an extraordinary way of effectively buying share of wallet and creating behavioural loyalty. Behavioural loyalty, which, by the way, tends to turn into emotional loyalty. That one of the most important scientific learnings is that actually our attitudes are a product of our behaviours as much as it works the other way around. And they repeatedly said, but they said, if free delivery is such a massive incentive in Amazon, why don't they just give it to everybody? And they were repeatedly asking this question. You fool, because actually, mentally, the value of a saving is much, much higher if you've had to pay for it. Degree of difficulty, degree of scarcity, degree of rarity have an enormous effect on how we perceive 10% off. 10% off to everybody we see as a basic signal of desperation on the part of the seller. 10% off because you've flown with us 4 times before this year, we see as an exclusive reward for our own worthy custom, and we value that as a discount far, far higher, even though it may be identical in economic terms. And finally, I don't know if we'll ever get to a theory of anything, or indeed whether it is actually possible. What we can do is start to fight the neoclassical assumptions with science of our own. It will be, to some extent, soft science. Game theory is another thing, which again is vitally important to understand. I've got an interesting theory about the frequent flyer program, which is that part of the reason it works. Now, classical economists will always say you get free flights, you get points, therefore the frequent flyer program works. And that's undoubtedly true to a degree. Part of the reason the frequent flyer program works is because it simply tells us that the airline knows how valuable we are to the airline. And if I know the airline knows how valuable I am as a customer, I therefore expect preferential treatment going forward from that airline. So I feel much more comfortable flying on British Airways, which I fly with a lot, because they know I fly with them a lot, and I get the feeling if I ever get snowed in Latvia, they're not going to bump me, they're going to bump a student, okay? Being blunt about it, okay? Whereas if I fly with EasyJet, who don't know who I am, there's this complete anxiety that I could fly with you 5 times a week for the next 20 years, and it would not make any difference to the treatment I receive. So that's interesting because it's about game theory, which is another field of science, which actually is to some extent mathematical. There are other fields. Austrian economics is particularly interesting because they actually refuse to use numbers. They actually refuse to use math. You very rarely meet Austrian school economists because they can't get a job anywhere, because they refuse to teach people the mathematics that's required. But then we can go forward and say, and this is where it gets really important, marketing in a way did it do itself a wonderful service when it started to produce lots of data, or did it shoot itself in the foot? And one client of mine said, in some ways, we were much better off when there was virtually no data at all. Because we just said to the finance guys, look, basically, you just got to trust me here. Go and spend 5 million quid, and in 3 or 4 months' time, you'll notice some stuff going upwards. And that was as far as it got. So their capacity to meddle with your every single action was quite limited. So they basically let you get on with it as marketers. Now, when we start producing huge amounts of numbers, they will seize those numbers. Now, the question is, what model will they apply to those numbers? If they apply the neoclassical economic model, basically, of perfectly rational human beings, this data could be used to an extraordinarily destructive effect. And so, fundamentally, the problem we have as marketing, very simply, is we have suddenly lots of data, but we don't have a model of human behavior. We don't have a theory. And why that's a problem is fundamental, because if you don't... Now, often people say, well, surely you should just look at the data and it should produce a theory, right? That's the sort of data mining, big data approach to it. Most good people argue that's completely wrong, that what you need to do in science is you start with a theory and the data will either reject it, confirm it, or refine it. And Darwin makes this point about the theory of evolution. He presented the theory of evolution based on his observations of his travels, where he compared the beak sizes and shapes of various birds. And quite a few people said, I don't understand why you need to get so theoretical about all this evolution stuff. Why didn't you just present the data? And Darwin replied quite clearly. He said, I can't believe people say this. He said, how does he not understand that until you have a theory, it's impossible to give data any possible meaning or significance? And then if you don't have a theory, you don't have a mental mug tree on which to hang your findings. You need a kind of mental mug tree on which you go, this is happening again. Well, I can mentally put that within this particular frame. So there are loads of sciences which are hugely marketing friendly. The Austrian School of Economics are massively marketing friendly, simply because they are obsessed with the idea of subjective contextual value. And Austrian people, because they believe in subjective value, will say that if you change the way someone looks at something, you've created value just as much as if you make the thing itself better. If you get someone to look at something in a new light or to frame it differently, that's as much a contribution to economic wealth and well-being as if you actually change the thing itself. There's also, behavioural economics, hugely important in terms of price framing. Does anybody buy rail tickets from those machines, those touchscreen machines? Two utterly terrible mistakes, one of which is all the machines are located at railway stations, so the only people they sell tickets to are people who've already decided to take the train. Okay. Why does Blue Water not have 5 rail ticket machines? There's huge footfall. If you sell at different points on a customer mental journey, you will sell more. Very simple thing, because our preferences are contextual. By and large, by the way, our preference to travel by train is much higher some period in advance, because we're less conscious of the hassle of parking and all the stuff, and what our mind tends to turn to is the enjoyable prospect of sitting down and reading a book for an hour and a half. So if you can find ways to get people to book rail travel earlier, you will sell more rail tickets, because our perception of what's good and bad completely shifts. You all know that experience where you bought Ryanair tickets for 3 months in advance because of the price, and then the day beforehand you get into that complete white-knuckle terror, and why the hell did I do this, and actually I just want to stay at home. That's a product of exactly the same temporal bias. Our biases in terms of price framing, Nespresso is the example I always give as a perfect example. M&S does it beautifully. Dine in for two for £10. M&S can't compete on price with Asda, Sainsbury's, Waitrose, anybody else, so they compare themselves with restaurant meals instead. Nespresso is very expensive. It's 26 pence per pod. If you had to buy a jar of Nescafe with equivalent sort of caffeine strength, it would be like paying about 120 quid for a large jar of coffee, and we couldn't bring ourselves to do it. It would just seem too painfully more expensive than we expected. But it comes in an individual pod, and we don't know what an individual Nescafe costs. So interestingly, our frame of reference when we put a pod in our Nespresso machine is not Nescafe, it's Starbucks. And we think, well, that would have cost me £2.40 at Starbucks, it's only 26p, the machine's practically making me money. How you frame, by the way, tickets. One of our clients, simply by putting a more expensive option alongside the less expensive option on the decision path, has just increased revenue by 38 million a year. Okay? Vital thing in all complex systems is that really small things can have big effects and big things can have no effect. We tend to think in a Newtonian way, as if we're working, and this is, neoclassical economics is basically a complete lie about human psychology in order to create a model that's mathematically neat. And it portrays human behavior as if it's kind of Newtonian and like a mechanism. Popper made the point that he said everything in the world is a spectrum between clouds and clocks. Things that are like meteorology or economies or ecosystems or markets, all the way to things that are kind of like bridges, which you can actually kind of mathematically model. And he says the worst mistakes that are ever made by humanity are trying to treat things that are clouds as if they're clocks. And that's, broadly speaking, what is my terror, which is with the data we produce, it will be seized on by people who are typically, you know the type, former engineer, former management consultant, trained in finance, had an MBA, okay, who have this extraordinary mechanistic model of how the world works, and they will attempt to construct neat mechanistic mathematical models from the data that marketing produces. My view is that actually we can fight this. The first thing you've got to do is there are about 4 or 5 fields. Complexity theory fascinates me because most of our markets are highly complex. Just to make clear about how mathematically difficult a complex system is, you know those brass balls that go around it? It's called a centrifugal steam regulator. And it was how you stopped steam engines going too fast in the 18th century. I think Watt developed one of the first ones. And the idea is as the engine goes faster and faster, centrifugal force drives the balls outwards, which raises a collar, which releases steam pressure, which causes the engine to slow down again. Okay? That's basically the simplest cybernetic device. It's about the simplest device you can create with a feedback loop. Okay? Now, interestingly, in order to mathematically model how it worked, the only person who could first do the maths was James Clerk Maxwell, who was one of the greatest mathematical geniuses of the 19th century. I mean, an extraordinary man who Einstein put alongside kind of Newton on this pinnacle of the great minds. The maths was so complex, they only had the computational power to actually make use of these equations sometime later, about 30 years later. And that is the simplest complex system you can attempt to model using this kind of mathematical approach. Now, network theory is starting to develop maths that are... Now, nearly all markets have extraordinary complexity. The idea that individuals, based on their own individual preference, of which they're consciously aware, actually go and maximize their own utility is extraordinary. I'll give you just an example of complexity of how much shit is going on, okay, in a market. First of all, markets seem to have a shape. And I'm very interested, why is it that Amazon and Google and certain things have this shape where the market leader is much bigger than the number 2? And then you've got other markets like Compare the Market, Go Compare, and the insurance aggregators, where you have 3 or 4 equally sized competitors. Why is it that those two things have a fundamentally different shape? Is it frequency of visit? Is there some frequency effect going on there that things you only do once a year, you don't have the same degree of disproportionate loyalty to things like a search engine or a bookshop? Therefore, if you're an online travel agent, should you contrive some side of your business to get people to visit much more often? There's an interesting organisation called Sleep Zachariah, which is an investment fund based on behavioural economic principles. 50% of their entire £500 million investment fund is in Amazon, because they respect it so much. And they put about 100 million into Ocado and actually made a fortune just after Christmas. Ocado is another case. If you're a finance guy, you're burbling on about all those weird finance measures of Ocado. As a marketing person, I've got a more interesting question about Ocado, which is basically what really appeals to me about Ocado is once you've used it 3 times, you never go back. Now, from a human-centered point of view, that's a highly significant piece of information which isn't captured necessarily in a balance sheet. So there is science we can all use. Wine is an example I give of a complex system. I have a particular rant because I think the British drink wine when it's totally inappropriate to drink wine. It's personal. It's very good with food, but those parties, you turn up at a party, there'll probably be one at lunchtime, and you turn up and there are 3 choices. There's water and there's red or white. And you stand there and you go, and how many people, be honest about it, how much have you got to spend on white wine before you can be sure it's better than the gin and tonic? My view is about 25, 30 quid a bottle, to be honest, or indeed never, if you really like gin and tonic. Okay. What's going on here? Is this just about the preference of people have for wine? There's certain elements of preference for it. There are certain aspects in that you can drink wine at lunchtime without people thinking you're an alcoholic, which is different from other alcoholic drinks. But look at a few other biases go on. It comes in it's actually a very unreliable drink. You know, no one could sell beer or spirits where every fourth pint smelt disgusting, okay? And yet when you buy a glass of wine in a pub, I would say the odds of it being disgusting are around 33%. And yet people pay £4.50 for it. You know, there are a whole load of utterly weird things going on here which don't really make sense. Now, one of them is, of course, if you have a party, wine comes in two colours. So if you buy both kinds of wine, you only need one lot of glasses, you automatically offer people a choice, because you can say red or white. The bottled water industry makes a fortune simply because it comes in two kinds, still or sparkling. What the hell is he talking about, you're saying? When a waiter comes to you and says still or sparkling, you tend to say one or the other. So you then end up buying a £4.50 bottle of water. If you ask the question, would you like water, it's much easier to say no or just tap water. It's very hard to say tap water in response. It's called choice architecture and framing, basically. It's very hard to say, no, I'll just have tap water in response to still or sparkling without feeling like a cheapskate. Wine, when you go to the supermarket, because it comes in an insane variety, dominates the shelf space. And we have an inner heuristic which tends to basically see facings as a proxy for product popularity and therefore quality. A very interesting thing is when you get to the booze section of the supermarket, you can just buy wine and take it home and you put the white stuff in the fridge. If you want to buy spirits at that point, suddenly you decide to buy gin, that requires going all the way back to the beginning of the supermarket to buy lemons or limes and then rootling around looking for ice or possibly mixers. To give you an example of how path dependency affects things, which is another scientific concept which is not understood by classical economics and incidentally is not mentioned much in marketing, when Sainsbury's and Asda created a thing called the cocktail pod, and it was in the spirit section of the supermarket, it was a freezer full of bags of ice, a range of bottles of mixers, and baskets containing lemons and limes. Spirit sales overall in those supermarkets went up by more than 8%. Now, how much would you have to spend on advertising at a brand-by-brand level to get all the spirit sales up by 8%? So my view is we can start to use the science of behavioral economics, of decision-making under uncertainty, heuristics, game theory. Brands, in my personal view, and we need to do more work on this, largely work through expensive advertised brands have an extraordinary market power through game theory, which is that when we buy something from somebody, one of the questions we ask is, what has this guy got to lose by ripping us off? And fortunately, we've evolved so that reputation is highly fragile. And someone who is famous or lives locally, you notice this, if you want to buy a second-hand car, you buy from someone who lives locally, not just a bloke you've met in a pub 200 miles away, because for him then, if he sells you a dodgy car, there's comeback, both reputationally and in theory, in the shape of a brick through a window. So when we buy anything, we ask the question, what have you got to lose? And a brand that's taken you many years to build and has invested a huge, many millions of dollars in its creation, has much more to lose by selling a short range of dodgy products than a brand you've never heard of. And that is instinctive. Our inner game theorist effectively trusts people who are reputationally rich and fragile, because they have much more to lose by selling us crap. If you think about it, if Philips produced 10,000 slightly dodgy tellies, they wouldn't put them on the market with Philips on them. If a Chinese brand like Noxin that you've never heard of produced them, they might just go and flog them. What Philips would probably do if they produced 10,000 dodgy tellies is sell them to Noxin on condition they sold them under their own name. But I mean, what it is, you're not going to put your name to something that actually, when your name has a huge amount of value. And that's the inner instinctive game theorist of the brain. Now, this is all science. It's not Newtonian physics, but the point is it shouldn't be Newtonian physics, because even in the most simple complex device of all, that Newtonian, the centrifugal regulator, it's not remotely Newtonian. The maths, using that kind of maths, the maths of simple engineering to describe human psychology, mass human behavior, or anything else, is just a category error. It's fundamentally wrong. So the final thing we have to do is borrow from this science as well to use phrases like hyperbolic discounting or endowment effect or whatever, or commitment bias or sunk cost bias. And if we start using these phrases, what is quite interesting is that finance guys find this stuff quite interesting. And we can talk to them about it. At the moment, as marketers, we have the worst vocabulary you could possibly imagine. Because if you think about it, a brilliant colleague of mine described it, he said, marketing vocabulary is like the vocabulary of astrology. If you're talking to a fellow believer, someone who's also into it. It all makes perfect sense. You go, oh, it's typical behavior. I know he's on the cusp, or whatever it is. You know, you say in astrology. My brother knows this very badly because he's a professional astronomer. He's building a telescope in the Atacama Desert. The worst thing that used to happen to him before he got married is you'd meet a girl at a party. She'd go, what do you do? I'm an astronomer. She'd say, that's very interesting. I'm a Sagittarius. But actually, going to a finance director or CEO with a finance background and talking about brand iconography is like going to the head of thoracic surgery at St Mary's Hospital, Paddington, and saying, we must trust to the healing power of the crystal. But it's doubly dangerous. One, to anybody outside marketing, it makes you sound like a whack job, okay, a total nutbag. But it's even worse because it also frightens people off from getting interested and involved. Because they go, these people have a really weird vocabulary, therefore if I get involved in marketing in even the slightest way, there's a huge risk I will look stupid. Now, again, I'll end on this. Complex systems theory, looking stupid should be a very trivial thing. We shouldn't make business decisions on the fear of looking stupid. I would argue instinctively the fear of looking stupid is probably the most powerful human instinct other than, like, you know, hunger, sex, and something else. It seems that our do I look stupid meter is one of the meters that runs continuously in the human brain. And just a bit more theory here. I would say the main reason why Coca-Cola is the best selling soft drink in the world is partly, in fairness, all credit to Coke. It is very difficult to produce an adult non-alcoholic cold drink that most people quite like. But there's another huge reason, which is it's the only soft drink in the world apart from water that you can ask for anywhere. And if they haven't got it, it's their fault, not yours. Even in France, you can ask for a Coke or a Coke Light, and actually, if the guy says no, you can say, well, you're a bit of a twit then, okay? Okay? Now think about it. There's automatic anxiety and looking stupid. I actually prefer, there's always one person in the audience who agrees with me. Who is it? I actually prefer Dr. Pepper. Come on, one confession? Yeah, two. Excellent. Delighted. Okay. I never ask for it because I know there will be that little awkward moment, which is, no, we don't sell Dr. Pepper, brackets unspoken, you idiot. Okay. Now, the vital thing about that is because path dependency, complexity theory, Darwinian psychology, and all these things are actually acting on us all the time, there isn't really necessarily a correlation between the scale of the intervention and the scale of the output. It is hugely dangerous. If you want to know why, read Hayek's 1972 Nobel Prize acceptance speech. He accuses economics and actually finance by association of scientism, which is the fake use of the tools of another inappropriate science to give the impression that your own discipline is scientific. He says, in nearly all marketing cases, the real variables that matter in the model are not available or not expressible in numerical form. Regret and Deal or No Deal is not numerically expressible yet. Maybe with neuroscience we'll get to a point where it is, but it isn't numerically expressible. What matters about the Eurostar is not necessarily, do I get there at the cost of 6 billion, do I get to Paris 35 minutes earlier? I would argue that the USP of a train, by the way, is actually the size of the table, that if you've got a big table, the train journey is actually productive time. You can have coffee, a laptop, a newspaper, etc. But there isn't. Everybody produces a high-speed train, not a LTT or large table train, as I would like to produce, because the engineers who make these decisions look purely at numerical variables. Comfort, enjoyment, pleasure, fun is not numerically expressible. Efficiency, speed, rolling stock utilization, you can mathematically model. So the net result of this is companies deploy enormous resources on things that make very little difference to people. By the way, fun, being perfectly fair. Has anybody used the business car park at Heathrow Terminal 5 where you ride in a pod? And
Best thing ever.
it's the best thing ever. And what's the sweetest thing of all is you see people arrive at the thing and occasionally it's full because although they're serious businessmen, deep down they want to ride in the pod, okay? They tell you it's because it's cheaper. It's about £2 cheaper than the short stay. It's trivial. They want to ride in the pod. And occasionally you're told, I'm afraid the business car park's full, so you can have a free upgrade to the short stay car park, which is closer and theoretically would normally be more expensive. And you can see their faces just full. I wanted to go on the pod. I actually then go to the short stay and just go on the pod back to the car park just for the hell of it. But actually, things like fun or pleasure or, there's no reason we pop bubble wrap, for God's sake. And bubble wraponomics strikes me as quite a promising field, those things which are just intrinsically enjoyable. But those things, because they're not numerically expressible, do not appear in the model. Therefore, the model totally misrepresents what's important. It's called, is it variable admission bias? Anybody here? that effectively the model you will come out with in something like regression analysis will totally change if you just add one more variable to it. It's extraordinarily sensitive. So this is the thing that worries me. So the vocabulary is the most important thing. The second thing is having our own theories and models of human behavior based on sciences which actually allow us to have a mental mug tree where we can assemble our findings. But most important of all, to have a language that enables us to fight back. Because as I said, this is a science. There are enormous sciences like game theory which have attracted the attention of the world's most intelligent people. Daniel Kahneman in behavioural economics has a Nobel Prize in economics, the first man to win a Nobel Prize in economics who wasn't an economist. He's a psychologist. These are really, really bright, good people with extraordinarily important ideas. And we must, for some bizarre reason, marketing's connections with academia completely disappeared around about 1975. If we bring these back, we can have a much more interesting battle and prevent this, what I call sort of numeracy bias, from actually taking over the world and leading it to perdition. Thank you very much. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah. Do we have any questions? Did you have slides?
No, deliberately not. No, I said.
I was waiting for the slides to come out.
No. Often I do that. That must be yeah.
Good. Good. I'm going to retitle your presentation From Lap Dances to Laptops.
Exactly.
Human behavior. I have a quick question, and then other questions, and then we'll take a break. I know you're talking a lot about the science, the new science of marketing. You're also involved with a book that has just come out. It's called Web Psychology, right?
That's correct, yes.
Can you give 2 seconds on that?
Very interesting woman called Natalie Nahai, who's studied both neuroscience and quite a lot of behavioral economics. And it's a very, very good and practical guide to how much of this actually applies on the web. So patently, choice design is an enormous area. What we choose, everybody knows that economist, the famous economist subscription experiment, do you? With the dummy variable. You had two choices, economist digital only, digital access only, $59, digital plus paper copy, $129. And about 2/3 of people chose digital only, because their mental frame was, oh, well, basically, if I get digital only, I'm saving $60 or so on the paper edition, which I don't really want that much. They put in a dummy option, which was paper subscription only, $129, the same as paper plus online. Nobody chose it, but suddenly 2/3 of people chose the paper plus online one, because suddenly their mental comparison was, if I get that, I'm getting $59 worth of online access for free. If you take, say, World Traveller and World Traveller Plus, if the World Traveller price is high, but actually the World Traveller Plus or premium economy price isn't much more, people who, if you only showed them the economy price, would go, bloody hell, that's expensive, will reframe that by, well, it's only 200 quid more to go in premium economy. That our perception of everything is almost entirely relativistic. And so one of the dangers about researching people out of context, which a lot of market research does, is first of all, we post-rationalize hideously, I think, and construct narratives about our behavior that are really just there to make ourselves look rational. But the other danger is our preference for anything. What do you pay for a pair of sunglasses on the high street? £10. Suddenly you find yourself at an airport and it's 100. Our preferences for everything are enormously contextual and relativistic. Any more? But this is a great book. One other thing, by the way, because of this is probably the most important thing marketing can do in terms of making money. Because of the dominance of the neoclassical economic model, which basically just assumed that making things cheaper made people like them more. In reality, actually, I had this big letter in The Economist where they got very angry because they said people prefer 50% extra free to 33% off, even though they're the same. And they obsessed on about how it was just evidence of numerical bias because 50 was a bigger number. Actually, I don't think it's anything of the kind. I think it's very simple psychology, which is 50% extra free is a bonus, 33% off is a mark of desperation. It suggests you can't sell your product at full price. And actually, what we're doing in sort of, second-guessing the market, our instincts may be more intelligent than our calculators. Probably is true. But this is a very interesting one. But the vital thing in marketing is price, the psychology of price. A book coming out written by a very good Brit very shortly on this. Effectively, the vital thing to understand with the psychology of price is that the neoclassical assumption is completely blind to all this stuff. I mentioned espresso as an interesting case. Maserati stopped putting their cars at car shows and started displaying their cars at boat shows and aircraft shows. Because if you've been looking at Learjets and 100-foot yachts all afternoon, You go, oh, well, I won't buy a yacht this year. It's been a bit of a bad year. £80,000, oh, I'll have a couple of those. It fundamentally changes the nature of what the expenditure is. But in terms of price experimentation, what you appear alongside, and I said to BP, only half jokingly, if you want to sell more BP Ultimate fuel, create a third fuel called BP Blingtastic Super Ultimate Plus that costs £15 a litre. People go, that's a bit expensive, I'll just have the ordinary Ultimate. One final thing, by the way, the city does know a bit about this. When the city prices 5 different investment options in order to 1 to 5 from the safest to the riskiest, they always design 2 and 4 to be more profitable than 1, 3 and 5. Because they know there's a huge, but no one wants to choose 1 because it makes them look boring. No one wants to choose 5 because it makes them look like a lunatic. And no one wants to choose 3 because it looks as if you're sitting on the fence. So everybody desperately wants to choose 2 and 4. So they make that more profitable. Understanding this stuff is absolutely extraordinary and can generally add an enormous amount of money to the bottom line with extraordinarily little effort or intervention. So that's an area which has been utterly unexplored, partly simply because classical economics thought it knew. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you. Fantastic.